Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. It's wonderful that you're with us here for this first ever NOFA Mass Winter Conference remote edition. We're so hopeful that we can see you all in person next year. We do miss seeing everybody in person. But we're so excited to be doing this and to be together today. So my name is Kara Roselle, and I'm the Education Director with NOFA Mass, and I'm here today with my colleague Fern Spire. We will be your session hosts today. And I'm so excited to introduce the presenter today. Whelley McCabe is the CEO of Vermont Evaporator Company, a small local family-run manufacturing startup making maple syrup evaporators, which offers evaporators both for professional level. Sorry, I just lost my bio here. Apologies, I was just letting someone in the waiting room. Both for professional sugar companies and for hobbyists alike. So Kate, who actually has a legal background, has also worked in public service on consumer protection, enforcement, and lobbying, which is very interesting. And I'm so excited to learn from Kate today.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So before we get started on Kate's presentation, we just have a few things to cover with you before we get going. So as many of you know, NOFA Mass really aims to make our working racial equity statement a living document that drives our work. So to heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system, we do urge our participants to act as allies for BIPOC communities. There's a few ways that you can start out doing that. One is to provide resources to BIPOC organizations such as money and time that are working to feed their communities. Another way is to be a partner and stand against white supremacist behavior and actions. Seen a few of those recently, nationally. And thirdly, to work to dismantle racism within the food and agricultural systems. By working together to dismantle racism in the food system, the Commonwealth can truly feed and serve the commonality of us all. We acknowledge that we are on land that was managed and inhabited before European colonization. Please take a moment to find your location on the Native Lands map and honor those whose lands you now occupy. And I'll be dropping a link to that map shortly. You can also find our sponsors in the virtual vendors market, where there are some great discounts for conference attendees. Please check them out. Our sponsors really make our conference possible, and I do encourage you to purchase from them. And when you do, let them know that you appreciate their support of NOFA Mass. Next slide. Next slide. So finally, last slide, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for spending the weekend with us, and especially to our NOFA members who make our education and advocacy work possible. Thank you so much. We're so excited to be here with you. So at this point, I think we will let Kate take it from here, and I'm so excited to learn about maple syrup tapping and evaporating.
Right, everyone. Thanks so much, Caro and NOFA for having me. My name is Whelley McCabe, and about 6 years ago now, my husband and I, both of whom were both attorneys actually, started Vermont Evaporator Company. And we did so because we moved to a 10-acre plot in Montpelier, Vermont, and noticed pretty quickly that we had a very nice sugar stand sort of across the creek and up the hill. A sugar stand is sugar makers speak for just a grouping of sugar maple trees. And so there's a particular spot in our 10-acre forest that's really dominated by sugar maple trees. And there's actually some architectural evidence that there had been sugar camps on that land in years past. And so a sugar camp is, maybe 50, 100 years ago, it would have been normal for a homesteader to actually have a small dwelling space apart from their house, perhaps a mile or even more than a mile away from where they live, where they would camp out and tend their maple stand, tap, collect, and sort of all hours of the day and in shifts. So there'd be these camps with bunks and outdoor boilers. So 10 years ago, we discovered these beautiful trees, and my husband wanted to start making maple syrup. He's kind of a serial hobbyist, but we didn't have a ton of time or money to invest in building a sugar house and buying a professional scale evaporator, which was our only sort of experience with sugar making. I grew up next to a hobby sugar maker that had a house, a designated house, and an industrial sized evaporator. And so that's what we were familiar with. We were looking for something portable that we could use outside and affordable, and we couldn't find it. And so what my husband did was invent something, and that something is called the Sapling Evaporator, and it's the machine that you see on our logo. It's a 55-gallon barrel that's been modified with a professionally engineered stainless steel pan, lead-free fittings and lead-free pour-off valve and the whole bit. The barrel itself acts as the wood firebox to generate the heat that helps the water evaporate off of the sap, leaving you with syrup. And that's the short story. Our company has grown to include my brother and sister-in-law. All the kids feel included. They're not always happy about it, but that's the way that goes. So my husband's the inventor and does a lot of the product development. I run the company with the assistance of my brother and sister-in-law. And this is our Sapling Evaporator in its natural environment. That is to say, outside on the driveway before it's muddy. Later in the season, it's not quite as picturesque, but to the left, you can see our stack of sugar wood and smiles and having fun together making maple syrup, which we do every March now. I want to reassure you that you don't need to take notes and you don't actually need to remember anything that I say because everything that I know, I've also blogged about. And here you can see a screenshot of our homepage. The blog is under Learn. It also has its own little space on that banner. It's, between shop and about us or something. So they're fairly well organized, I think. And like I said, everything that I'm going to say today is I've written about. So you can feel free to just relax and have a good time today. I've also compiled those blogs into a guide. It's about 60 pages long called Backyard Maple, a guide to making maple syrup at home. That guide comes with our maple syrup starter kit, which has buckets and spiles and a maple syrup thermometer, a tapping bit, and filters. And that is, in our opinion, we've curated the sort of bare essentials for maximizing the fun and maximizing the quality of what you make sort of your first time out. Like I said, 60 pages of information is a part of that. So when I talk to people about making maple syrup, I talk about it in terms of a calendar that starts in late summer and early fall, moves through early winter, and then late winter, early spring, which is when, the sugaring happens, and continues late spring and into the summer. And I do that because it really is a year-long hobby. And there's something in every season for the hobby sugar maker. So we're long past fall right now, but I'm still going to start at the very beginning because the first thing that someone needs to do who wants to make maple syrup on their own property at home is to identify their trees. And there's a couple of things that are important to note at the outset when thinking about identifying your trees. The first is that it's an awfully lot easier if you identify your trees while they still have leaves. And it's even easier when those leaves are starting or continuing to change color in the fall. And that will become clear as I'll tell you why here in the next couple of slides. The other thing to know is that any maple will do. Fern from NOFA and I just had a pretty interesting conversation about one of her trees, which is a silver maple. There are many different species of maples, and they all give sap that has sugar content that, depending on who you ask, tastes pretty much the same. And I can tell you from my particular experience that sugar maple and red maple sap tastes exactly the same. The sugar maple is so named because it, of all the trees, not just of all the maples, but of all the trees, has the highest concentration of sugar in its sap. And so it is the most commercially promising tree for a professional sugar maker. So you probably already know, if you've been interested, if you're interested enough to show up to this class, that it takes 40, on average, 40 gallons of sugar maple sap to make 1 gallon of sugar maple syrup. A red maple is more like 60 to 1. And then other kinds of maples are sort of north from there. So you may get an 80 to 1 silver maple, or a big leaf maple out west that is something north of 60 to 1. So sugar maples are certainly the easiest and the fastest, but some folks like myself have a lot of red maple along with their sugar maple. Our red maple happens to be more accessible. And so we probably have more reds than sugars on our current sort of project scale. We're at about 50 taps. We haven't even exploited that sugar stand that I talked about because it's far away and it's big. So we're sort of starting with the things that are around our home and easy to find. So easiest to identify your trees when it's fall, and be open-minded about what kind of maples you're going to use. Think about accessibility as well as how hard you're willing to work for that sweet stuff. So the sugar maple is shown here. It has, it's you know, many technical definitions of the leaves of trees will allow for 3 or 5 lobes. And by lobes, I'm talking about the sections of those leaves. So the sugar maple looks to me like it has 5 lobes, although technically may say, you know, the technical readout may say 3 or 5. You'll notice that the edges of those leaves are very smooth. They're not like a serrated bread knife. They're like, you know, a cleaver, right? And like the drawing suggests, but not the picture, the red maple or the sugar maple is sort of eligible to turn any color in the fall. It is that rainbow tree that you see. Whereas in contrast, on a number of those levels, while the red maple leaf is technically allowed to have 5 lobes, it really looks a lot more like 3 to me. You can also see in this picture, maybe better in the drawing that I've made, that the red maple has serrated edges, not smooth edges. So it is like a bread knife and not like a meat cleaver. And then also that the red maple is probably so named because in the fall, it tends to turn that bright red. And then in the spring, it actually has, the buds are very obviously red. And so for both of those reasons, or one of those reasons, is why we call that tree the red maple. And then finally, this is what a silver maple leaf looks like. The silver maple leaf has 5 lobes, but they're skinnier than the sugar maple. And the silver maple leaf is smooth on the edges, not serrated, like the sugar maple. And then this picture will show you that the silver maple is actually probably so named because the underside, when compared to the leaves of other maples, is light, giving it the effect, if you sort of stand back in a breeze, you may think that you're seeing silver when you see those leaves flutter in the wind. So this infographic sort of puts everything that I've just said together. That is to say, sugar maple, you're looking for 5 fat lobes, smooth edges, and multicolors in the fall. The red maple, you're looking for 3 fat lobes, sawtoothed edges, and early red foliage in the fall. And then for silver maple, you're looking for 5 skinny lobes, smooth edges, and a light green or a silver on the underside. The silver maple also happens to be late to turn in the fall. If you're seriously considering sugaring in this upcoming season and you haven't yet identified your maple trees, it is not impossible to do using the bark of that tree. Or if you're enterprising, maybe scoop away some snow, or maybe your snowpack isn't that heavy right now, to look at the leaves that have fallen from that tree. You won't have the color cues, but you'll still have the shape of the leaf. I've certainly done that myself, and you can give a good guess based on you know, what the bark looks like and what leaves you're able to find in the base. You'll also want to think about the time that it's going to take and the fuel that you're going to need for your hobby. So you'll want to size your hobby. We normally, and I'll probably repeat this later when we talk about sugar wood, but if you're going to use wood as your heat source, we normally plan on having about a half a quart of wood per every 5 gallons of syrup that we plan on making. A hobby is measured in taps. 1 tap on a tree will produce about an average of 20 gallons of sap over the course of the season. 20 gallons of a sugar maple, of course, converts to about a half a gallon of syrup. On our best equipment, on our best day, we can evaporate 8 gallons of water in an hour. So you want to do a little bit of math to find out just how much you plan on making, just how much time, you know, whatever your bottleneck is, you know, how many mason jars you have, or is it time? Is it how many weekends you want to spend or how many hours you want to spend? And do a little math to figure out, okay, I think I can handle a 10 tap hobby or a 50 tap hobby. My experience has been that a 25 tap hobby is a very respectable place to start. Our first year out with our sapling, we did 25 taps. Now, keep in mind, some of those are red maples. So 25 taps, and we made 5 gallons in about 3 weekends. And we used about a half a quart of wood. So that'll give you some kind of ballpark as you think about acquiring your tools and equipment, which is the next thing that we're going to talk about. It'll give you some sort of a ballpark for deciding how big you'd like your hobby, your start to be.
Hey, Kate, this is Fern. And somebody asked about Norway Maples. I was waiting for you to be done there. About, wasn't quite sure what that question was, but something about Norway Maples and maybe how much they produce and the leaves and things like that.
Yep. So the Norway Maple is a really popular, I guess, like decorative tree. It's actually an invasive species. So it's kind of gets a bad rap, but it can be tapped. And that sap can be boiled down to make syrup. The ratio is not good. It's more along the 60 or 80, as far as I understand. And some people have said about the Norway maple that the sap comes out cloudy. I'm not really sure what that's about. Whenever I talk about this or write about it, there seems to be a little bit of a controversy about whether it's any good. But I do know that there's plenty of people that have boiled down Norway maple to make maple syrup and think that it's great. So my opinion is that it's worth a shot. Oftentimes the customers that I have that are in suburban or urban areas are using Norway maple because that's what they have access to. Cool. Okay. So early winter, at about the same time that you're like starting to get your seed catalogs, right? So November, December, January, you're thinking about what you're going to plant in your garden. You're also going to be thinking about making sure that you have the things that you need to tap, collect, store, evaporate your sap, and then process and store your syrup. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the things that you need to acquire. First of all, you need a drill and a bit. This piece of art shows you what's called a brace, and that's the old way of tapping a tree. It's a hand drill that you sort of lean against with your chest. These days, most of us use the good old electrical drill with the battery, rechargeable battery. So it's likely if you're attending this that you probably have some kind of a tool that drills, and it is possible to use the bits that you already own if you have a bit that is of the same size as available taps. Taps come in 2 sizes, 7/16 of an inch and 5/16 of an inch. The 7/16 of an inch taps tend to be either antique or older. because those were standard size for most of the history of sugar making, or at least most of the history of sugar making and in the post-colonial era. Those make, as you can tell, a bigger wound in the tree than a 5/16 bit. And so the industry and increasingly hobbyists have moved from 7/16 taps to 5/16 taps. So we offer, the tap that we offer is a 5/16 tap, and the spiles or spouts that we offer are 5/16 as well. But if you're acquiring used equipment, which is certainly widely available, you will have to check to see whether you're a 7/16 or a 5/16 operation before acquiring those things. Buckets and spiles. So this is a picture of an antique cast iron spile, very romantic, and a galvanized bucket. There's nothing wrong with using these spiles, unless of course you want to go to a 5/16 versus a 7/16 for the health of the tree. The galvanized buckets, also very much widely available. Don't buy them as antiques, buy them, from a farmer who has a bunch in his or her barn. The galvanized buckets may contain lead. So while my family used them for the first 5 years of our enterprise, we have made the choice to switch to an aluminum bucket, which are the buckets that we sell. I have seen people line their galvanized buckets with food safe plastic. And some people are not concerned about the lead because, lead leaches at certain temperatures. And as long as you take the sap out of your buckets in a prompt manner, don't let it sit in the sun, et cetera, people feel like they've mitigated the risk that way. I would never sell a leaded bucket. In fact, it's probably illegal to sell a leaded bucket for purposes of food manufacturing. And that's part of the reason why we switched, is because we wanted to take photographs using the things that we sell. But if you have access to them and can line them, it's a perfectly serviceable bucket. Some of these things are hundreds of years old, and good on you for reusing and reducing. You're going to want a lidded container, right? So some of the choices, we've talked about the choice about the size of the spile, 7/16, 5/16. You also have a material choice with the spile. We sell aluminum. There are plastic spiles out there as well, much cheaper. The buckets also come, like I talked about, the old ones are in galvanized. The new ones will either be in aluminum, which is what we carry, or stainless steel, which is harder to find and tends to be more expensive. No matter what you do, you're going to need a lid. So there are certainly plastic buckets out there, and some people use, reuse things like food safe 2-gallon buckets that, say you have a friend who's in restaurant supply, or you yourself do value added food and, can collect those 2-gallon plastic food safe buckets that have lids over the course of a year. Great. Some people also use things like milk jugs or cider jugs that they've washed out really well. That's fine too. You just want to make sure that you reduce the likelihood that squirrels are going to get into your bucket, because it happens even if you have a lid, and it's a sad thing. You're also going to want to think ahead and make sure that you have some collection and storage buckets. So, this is just, and the really important thing for a collection is that you have handles and that it's food safe. So here we have 2 food safe plastic buckets, looks like about 5 gallons. And this is my daughter on collection day, hauling the sap back to where it's going to be boiled. In terms of storage, so most of us small producers or hobby producers, we don't boil right when the sap comes out of the tree. Now, if you talk to a professional sugar maker, they'll tell you you've got to boil the sap when it comes directly out of the tree. And for a commercial operation, I can see how that might be true. You need to just have control over how long that sap is sitting wherever it's sitting, and that would be very difficult to do on a large scale. But on a small scale, what we've found, and through our own experience and through thousands of conversations with other hobby sugar makers, is that you can store sap for a week, week and a half in a refrigerated situation with no adverse effects whatsoever to its sugar content or to its taste or to its behavior in the boil. So what you're looking at here is a food safe 55-gallon blue drum. They're fairly widely available. And this is how we store our sap. Right now, this picture is a picture of our sap being stored in the garage. We might not have had snowpack that year. Normally when we have snowpack, we'll just use 55-gallon drums in a snowbank on the north side of a building. That way we know that the sun's not hitting it and it's basically in nature's refrigerator, half covered up with a pile of snow. Sugar making happens, and you'll see a map later on in this presentation, all over the country in places you had no idea people were making maple syrup. So for example, some folks that I've talked to in North Carolina and Virginia and Southern Pennsylvania never have snowpack during the sugaring season, which is starting just about now. And so they'll put their sap into sealed containers and put it in the creek or something like that. So, and still with, because that water's, in the 40s, still emerge a week or a week and a half later with sap that's fresh enough to boil. We did just come out with a new product. It's called the Sugar Cube, and it's a home scale reverse osmosis machine that has a UV filter. So in addition to concentrating your sap with sugar maple, 40-to-1 to 20-to-1. So it's kind of like it'll speed up the process by 50%. It also has a UV filter that will take out the bacteria and yeast that would otherwise eat your sugar and sour your sap. So our hope is that, our aim is, and what our data shows, that the UV filter extends that from a week and a half, even longer. At some point, organic matter will spoil, but that extra step has allowed us to sort of push out the amount of time that we can store that sap. And that's important for hobbyists because we all work for a living, right? So except for the odd Wednesday off, we're sugaring on Saturday and Sunday. These days with people working so much from home, I certainly have customers that will work and boil at the same time, set their kitchen timer for a half an hour, go outside, put more logs on the fire. It's not the fastest way to boil, but it's a pretty good life. So that is storage. The last thing that you're going to need is a plan for how to evaporate. And really the only thing you need, notwithstanding what I do for a living, what you need is a heat source and a cooking vessel. And that can come in a whole range of looks. Here are some looks that are, wood-fired. Here we've got somebody who's rigged up some bricks and some, cinder blocks, and looks like they've even employed some aluminum foil, and they have a fire underneath. That's a stainless steel hotel pan, I'm sure. Here we've got, this is a very bad idea. Buckets over an open fire is slow, and you can see there's ice there. But plenty of people use an oil tank or a barrel to make their own sort of firebox and then get a food grade pan to evaporate. All those things will work. Another thing that will work if you don't have access to firewood in the quantity that you're going to need is, plenty of people brick in a propane, like a turkey boiler propane burner. That'll work too. It'll work with this hotel pan, and it'll work with the pans in the line of pans that we sell as well. Totally respectable place to start. What all we've done is take an idea that was pre-existing and engineer it so that it's mass producible and efficient. The other major improvement that we've made on sort of the DIY unit is that we've engineered a pan that's a continuous boil pan that I'll talk about in a little bit. continuous boil pan allows you to put sap into the batch at the same time that you're drawing off syrup. And like I said, we'll get into that when we get into the sort of the how to tap and boil and store. So that's your list of equipment. We've added recently to our line and to our suggestion to starters that you also think about getting filters. You can see that there's two kinds here. There's a filter with loops on it. That's a filter proper. And then the other filter which looks a little thinner because it is a pre-filter. And you can see in the picture to the left that the pre-filter goes inside the filter proper and acts to take out sort of the big stuff as you're filtering your finished product. We also have added a thermometer. These two things are not, strictly speaking, necessary if you're really just wanting to experiment your first time out. But our experience is that they have, the filters allow you to make syrup that doesn't have sort of grit at the bottom of the jar when you're giving it away, for a holiday, or pouring it out onto your own pancakes. And the thermometer just takes the guesswork out of knowing, am I at syrup yet? And then finally, you are going to need something to store that syrup in, and ball jars work great. Ball jars with new lids, not necessarily bands, but new lids. You put that syrup at a particular temperature into that ball jar, and you turn it over so that the syrup sterilizes the lid for about 30 seconds. That syrup will last up to 2 years on the shelf, so no refrigeration or freezing necessary. There's also, of course, fancy bottles for gifting, some of which we carry now because we found that they're pretty hard to find in small quantities for folks that, the folks that we talk to. It's like everybody says, yeah, I just make a little, enough for my family and some to give away. And so, what we keep here in our family, we put in our, half-gallon ball jars, and what we give away, we put in our fancy jars. So we've done late summer and fall. We've identified trees and talked about different kinds of maple. And then we've gone through the list of things that you need. Now we'll get into the fun part, and that is how to tap, boil, finish, and store your maple syrup. So tapping your trees happens when the tree itself freezes at night and the tree itself thaws during the daytime. So normally when people talk about this, they say daytime temperatures are above freezing and nighttime temperatures are below freezing. And that's, it's true, but it's a bit imprecise, because if you have a 28-degree day that's really sunny and you've got a southern slope, that tree, that maple tree is going to be running. That sap's going to be running. Whereas if you have a 40-degree day that's really overcast and maybe drizzly, you might not get sap on that day. And it's because the motion of the sap is really tied to the temperature of the trunk and the tree itself. And that tree is a heat sink. And so it's going to respond both to the ambient temperature in the air and also to the sunlight. So just keep that in mind. It is true that sap flows during daytime thaws when nights are still freezing. But keep in mind that the sun plays a role, and you'll want to check your buckets on a 27-degree sunny day. Here's the map I promised you, with a whole bunch of other drawings of different kinds of maples, but also with filled in those states where there is at least on a hobby scale, a maple producing presence. And so this is a surprise to me, maybe a surprise to you, that there are actually 38 states from all sorts of different species of maple where people are making their own maple syrup. And until recently, I was very skeptical about this whole West Coast proposition, but I've just sold 3 evaporators to Washington State. So it must be true. So the answer to the question of when you're going to tap will depend entirely on your geography. So what state you live in, what elevation you're at, and whether your stand is on, like I was just talking about, sort of the south face of a hill, the north face of a hill, not on a hill at all. So aspect, elevation, and climate as well. Right now, I'm talking to customers that are in southern Illinois, Missouri, that are thinking about tapping, this next week. And I'm selling to customers in Southern Pennsylvania, for example, who are, calling a lot to make sure that I'll be able to get them their stuff in like a couple of weeks because they think they're going to be tapping at the end of January. Here in central Vermont, it was always traditional to tap on town meeting day, which is the first Tuesday in March. That, due to the climate warming, that has certainly been pushed back. February is more normal for a tapping for a hobbyist in Vermont. The professionals, because they have vacuum and so many trees that they couldn't possibly tap them all at the last minute, professionals are already tapping for this season for sure. All right, this is a work in progress, but it'll help me remember to tell you all the things you need to know about how to tap a maple. So assuming you know that you're walking up to a maple tree, you're gonna have your drill with your drill bit and your tap, and you're gonna have your bucket, and you're gonna have a hammer. And you're gonna walk up to your maple tree and sort of think about a couple of things. You're gonna look for a big branch or a big root. It's best to tap below a big branch or above a big root because those are sort of sap superhighways in a tree. You're gonna be avoiding any knots or wounds in a tree. And in fact, after you tap, if what comes out isn't nice, creamy white wood, you're gonna wanna choose another place on that tree. You're going to want to think about the snowpack. Snow melts throughout the season. You'll start the season likely with some snowpack in this area of the woods, but you'll end the season possibly even on bare ground. And so remember that snow melts. Don't tap so high that collection is going to be unergonomic for you. That's not very much fun. The size of your tree is going to matter in terms of how many taps you can put in that tree. So you don't ever tap a tree that's under 12 inches in diameter. And a 12 to 18 diameter tree gets 1 tap, 18 and over can get 2 taps. It is not recommended that any tree, no matter how big it is, get more than 2 taps for the health of that tree. I'll give you the first foray into organic standards here. Sort of everybody says and everybody knows that you gotta go away by some distance from last year's tap hole or from other year's tap holes. So what you're going to do is look your tree over and see if you can find a spot that is 12 inches away in height and 6 inches away laterally. And that's actually the organic standard for how far away one tap has to be from another. So you might tend to work your way around a tree as you go. Eventually the tree will heal its tap hole so that you can't see it. And that's the point at which you stop measuring away from that tap hole because you can't see it. So you find your spot in the tree. And what you're looking to do with that drill and that drill bit is to drill a 1 to 1.5 inch deep hole at a slight upward angle with your bit, and then tap in gently that spile and hang your bucket. And then you're going to be moving on to your next tree. The cardinal direction of the tree, it might matter. You might, if you really want to nerd out about it, you might want to think about tapping some trees on the south and other trees on the north. Might extend your season, or you might want to have an early season, or you might, in another year be going on vacation and want a late season. You can play around with that, keep notes, and figure out how your trees behave in different weather situations. But it's not something that you necessarily need to think about the first time out. And then you wait, right? So you think you've cased the weather, and you think when you need to tap, and you tap, and then typically you've jumped the gun because you're so excited, and you have to wait for a couple weeks before the sap runs. And this is what we look like when we wait. We're all ready to go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about boiling now, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of a baffled pan, which is what we sell, and which is what is used. It's sort of the most basic professional design for like a real evaporator, a real indoor professional evaporator. And like Caro said at the beginning, we definitely market to individuals, just homeowners, hobby farmers, homesteaders, real regular people. But we do find ourselves selling to outfits like small farms, like tree to table sort of restaurant outfits, and even distilleries and schools and nature centers. So we certainly have some sort of professional or semi-professional makers as well. So here we have our pan, and you can see that it's got 3 chambers. What you can't see well because of the steam is that the chambers are not sealed from one another. So in this picture, the back left corner starts the river, which goes in an S curve toward the front right corner. So there's cutouts in both of those baffles that create a stream that is about 10 by 30 over a 20 by 30 firebox. Excuse me, 10 by 60 over a 20 by 30 firebox. And the reason that this design works has to do with a principle of physics called a gradient. And in this case, we're talking about a sugar gradient. What you see, the additional pan on the back of the evaporator in this picture is a warming pan, and it takes the sap up from the temperature of the air, right? Or the temperature of the refrigerated situation that you had it in. And it allows the ambient heat from the boil to heat it up a little bit. It also has a little spigot, and you can see if you look at the picture closely that the spigot is open enough to let out just drips and drizzles of sap. So the way you operate this pan, and the reason I included this picture is to show you that you can see the sugar gradient. So I'll flip back and forth here as I'm explaining. But the way you use a pan like this is to put a couple of inches of sap in the bottom of the pan and to start your fire and to watch the level of the liquid sort of start to drop. And then to start introducing new sap into the point of the pan that is farthest away from the pour-off valve. And you can see in this picture, this is the best picture that demonstrates that. So you're putting in new sap, and instead of mixing with the stuff that's already in there, it self-separates. So in this picture, you can see light, medium, and dark. The back of the pan has the most fresh sap, and the front of the pan has the sap that's most sweetened or most like syrup. As long as you continue to keep putting in new sap at the opposite corner, you will see that self-segregation, and eventually we'll be able to pour off something that's either syrup or very close to syrup at the same time that you're putting in sap. It's called continuous boil, and it's an efficiency improvement over a batch system, which is how many people start and is a totally fine way to do it. The efficiency gain is that you're able to add more sap without killing your boil. Anybody who's made pasta knows that it's a lot easier to keep water boiling than it is to bring it up to a boil. It takes less energy, and that's the same with sap. And so this pan just allows you to go a little faster or a lot faster than a batch method. When I say batch method, I'm just talking about using any old pan, putting in a bunch of sap, boiling it down to almost syrup, putting in more sap, boiling it down again, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to take more energy. It's going to take longer. You're going to have darker syrup by the end of your boil, but it will work. Another thing people do is they sort of get close to this divided pan, get close to that efficiency by having a series of pots or pans. One where they put the fresh sap that they then ladle into a middle pan that they then ladle into sort of a third or finishing pan. So heat source, cooking vessel. We've just taken it another step further. Most people who are just starting out will not finish on wood. So wood is a wonderful, efficient, hot source of flame for your sugaring hobby, but it's very hard to control. And when you're making syrup, you want to get it up to a certain temperature. Temperature is about 219 degrees or 7 degrees above where water boils. But you don't want to go any farther than that, because then you're coming up with a different product. You can almost see, if you squint at this maple syrup thermometer, you're going towards cream, candy, and sugar. Okay, all those things taste really good, but if you don't plan to make cream, candy, or sugar, and you accidentally make it, and I can say this from experience, it's very messy. And after all of the work that you've put in, can be a little frustrating. So most people either finish on some propane next door to their outdoor situation, or like this picture suggests, brings that sweetened sap that they've poured off their big boil into the house to use, a maple syrup thermometer in a place where you can read it and have your sterilized jars and so forth, and your filters if you're using them right nearby. At the point, many people start out making maple syrup on their stove from start to finish, and they find that they make a giant mess of their house. If you bring in your sweetened sap just to finish, it doesn't make a mess of your house. It's no more messy than boiling pasta. Normally, I get impatient with my boil at about the point that I've brought it from 40 to 1 or 60 to 1 down to about 2 to 1. And so when I've just gotten a feel for how I operate, how the boil looks when I pour it off, and then sort of paying attention to what the volume change is when I get it inside. So I'm really looking mostly to, generally speaking, reduce the volume again by half once I have my sweetened sap inside. But I do really like the maple syrup thermometer for how precise it is. Like I said, you can use any thermometer that you trust and get it to about 219. You can also get a feel for how it acts on a plate. Take your sweetened sap, put it on a plate and move it around and see if it acts like you think syrup might. I've already told you what happens when you overcook syrup. When you undercook syrup, it's a little runny and it doesn't keep for as long, but it still tastes good. So it's a perfectly respectable place to end up on your first year out. Oh, I didn't realize that was a video. Here okay, so there we are. We're set up. You can see so we've got some fancy bottles in the foreground. We've got our pot we're finishing, and then in the background you can see the filters. If you're not filtering, pretty darn easy. What you're looking to do is get the syrup into the jar and get the cap on that jar and the jar over on its side so that the liquid inside the jar can help by sort of cauterizing the lid. When the syrup is still either 180 or north of 180 degrees, right? So if you're not filtering, that's pretty darn easy to do because you're taking the actual boiling stuff and putting it in the jar. If you are filtering because you're putting them in fancy jars and you're giving them away as gifts, or you just want to eliminate the possibility that you might have some minerals that collect at the bottom of your jar, you just need to sort of set yourself up so that you can move fast, right? So you're going to take your syrup that you've just measured in some way as syrup, and you're going to get it through the filters. What you can almost see in the background is something that you might recall from before, and that is that we've got pre-filters inside the filter proper. So we've got a couple of things that feel more like coffee filters inside something that looks like felt. And that's to take the big chunks out and you put 2 in so that when the first one gets hopelessly gunked up, you take it out and you just keep rolling. And that helps you move quickly, like I said, so that you can get your syrup inside the jar at an appropriate temperature. If you lose your window, just put it in a clean pot, heat it up again, and then get it into the jars after it's been filtered. And it's something that you'll get better at. And what you're looking to do is to get something that's this clear. So this syrup, this is the first year that we filtered our syrup, and we were impressed with its clarity for the first time. So that's really it. Until we get to post-sugaring season, that's really all you need to know. Post-sugaring season, like I said, there's still things to do in the late spring and the summer. It's important both for the health of the tree and another organic standard. You always take the taps out of your trees. And then you have to collect and clean and store your equipment so that you can use it next year. Taps can be cleaned by boiling them in water for 15 minutes and then laid on a towel to dry. Buckets merely need to be rinsed. What you see in the background here is an antique bucket washer. This is an electric bucket washer that has that giant brush on it that goes around, and it makes it really easy and really fun to clean your buckets. And then your pan is probably the hardest thing to clean, especially if you've been using wood. And so the easiest and sort of least interventionist way to clean your pan, there's certainly things you can buy to clean stainless, but the sort of easiest way to do it is to have another boil in your pan with a weak baking soda water solution. Boil it for 30 minutes, let it sit for like overnight or 24 hours, and then just wipe with a soft cloth. You'll be able to wipe the sugars and other pieces of debris that may be in your pan after your boil. You'll be able to wipe it right off. You're not going to want to use any detergents. You're not going to want to use anything scratchy on your pan. You're just going to want to use a soft cloth to do that. Really tough, tough stains, you might need to do it twice, but I've actually never experienced that myself. So it's easier than it looks. And then we're off season. So when we're into late spring and summer, there's still some things to do. You can think about your next sugaring season and make sure that you've collected your wood. So most professional sugar makers who still make syrup with wood, and there are many of them around this area at least, swear by some combination of hard and soft wood. But most people who sugar at home do so sort of in the most economically feasible way possible. And for us, that means burning the things that we wouldn't burn in the house. So most of us are using pine or other carnivorous trees. Most people who have enough trees to make a hobby out of making maple syrup also have enough fallen wood or pine to put together some cordwood for their hobby. What you can see here is that we're splitting that wood a little more than we would for wood that's coming into the house to burn. And in fact, when we're boiling itself, we may not dry the wood so thin, but when we're boiling, we'll chop that, split that wood thin enough so that it's like the thickness of your arm, so that it burns really, really hot and really, really fast. If you find yourself wanting to sugar, but you feel like you don't have adequate resources in terms of wood, we've had great success calling up local mills and asking for what's called slag wood, which is the sort of the bark and the curvy bits of a tree that are taken off when a log becomes board feet. So they have all this bark and sort of useless or, wood that's not marketable for them that you can typically get by the truckload for as low as like $10 a truckload. So it's worth checking out. You may have to chainsaw it and split it after you get it, but it's definitely worth checking out. And then finally, there are ways that you can take care of the health of your sugar woods on the off season. And I have put some time into learning what those ways are by talking to local forestry folks here in Vermont, and have put together, and again, this is something that I've blogged on extensively, put together some really easy directions on how to care for your sugar woods, especially in a changing climate. So you may have read, and it is true, that global warming is going to change the geography of professional sugar making. And I say professional sugar making because it's the sugar maple itself that is the tree that is going to be under strain when as our climate continues to warm. So the geography of the sugar maple will be moving north, and it is already moving north. The places where the sugar maple itself can thrive is moving north. That's because of the sort of what the sugar maple needs. The sugar maple needs a certain temperature to germinate. It needs a low temperature to germinate. The sugar maple needs well-draining soil and does not do well in places that may have, for example, too much rainfall. So as we get different weather patterns and warmer temperatures, the sugar maple is going to be sort of pushed north. Like we've talked about, other maples will do, especially for hobbyists. So I don't imagine that the area where people make maple syrup as a hobby is really going to change that much. But there are certainly things that we can do to just on our own land to make sure that our little piece of the world is going to be more resilient going into change. There's basically three things that we do on our land that I've learned about. The first is to identify and remove invasive species. And the three big invasives that are in our woods, in our sugar woods, are all in this cart behind my son, my helper. And those are Japanese buckthorn, buckthorn, Japanese barberry, and invasive honeysuckle. You can tell invasive honeysuckle apart from native honeysuckle by whether it's hollow. The stems of invasive honeysuckle are hollow. So, when it's spring, when it's summer, it's an easy time to go around, map your property, find out where your invasives are, and remove them by, mechanical means. The best is to get them up by the root. You can hang them in a tree if you don't want to cart them around your property, or you can put them in a bonfire. It is a federal offense, I think, or at least it's illegal in Vermont. It might not be a federal offense. It's illegal in Vermont to take invasives off your own property. So just be careful about, disposal by, getting them off your property, even in garbage bags. So think about lighting them a fire. It's important to map though, because you may not be able to pull everything out. You may not see everything the first time around. You're probably going to end up chopping some of that stuff off and maybe covering it with some burlap to discourage the roots from producing new growth. So that's item number one, sort of seek and destroy invasive species. Item number two is to go out, take a walk, and look at what kind of biodiversity you have in your woods in terms of your tree species. Monoculture, which was the standard of sugar making in the 1950s, is not good. And so if you have a monoculture, or if you only have a couple of different kinds of trees, think about planting or clearing around, an oak, or making sure that you've got some hemlock and some red maple in with your sugar maples. If you've got half a dozen different kinds of trees, you're doing great. You can sort of move on to the next thing. And then finally, the last thing to keep in mind is that it's good for your woods to be messy. Many of us want to sort of organize and control things and make things beautiful, and that's great. But the woods need standing dead trees, and they need logs on the ground, and our waterways need a buffer. So leave the dead trees, leave the logs, and let there be shade. Don't clear up too close to your waterways. Because of my audience, I have tried to sort of shout out whenever I'm brushing up against an issue of organic standards. I have blogged about that as well. If you're in there, are links that will show you just exactly how to make sure that your maple syrup production, even if it's a hobby scale, is sort of in accord with organic standards. There's another standard out there called bird-friendly maple, and that's something that you might like to look at. I'm positive that there's almost entire overlap between the two kinds of standards, but bird-friendly maple was a project that was started in 2014 when it became clear that that songbird habitat was really kind of being squeezed out by the growth of the Vermont maple industry. And that brings me to sort of a final point about organic maple is that the maple industry is really only now seeing the kind of industrialization that caused us to go away from organic farming in the first place in other crops, right? So we're at a different point in maple production than we are for other kinds of crops. And so when you look at the organic standards, you won't see that there's a whole lot, when I talk to professional sugar makers, they say, well, no, I don't have the certification, but I do all those things. And so the practices, at least until very recently, the practices of sort of your salt of the earth, maple farmer are not normally that far away from the organic standards. And so that's kind of a nice thing to know about maple, is that even if it's not certified organic, maple farmers are taking pretty good care of their lands, at least so far. So, and then just to close, I really like the way that NOFA talks about the earlier occupants of the lands that we live in. And so I just wanted to share with you that while I live on Abenaki land right now, the Abenaki were part of a confederacy, Wabanaki Confederacy, that included the Micmac people. Micmac were typically in present-day Maine and Nova Scotia, and included my family heritage. This is my matriline, and the woman seated in the front is my great-grandmother, who was a Micmac Indian. So to the extent that maple runs in the blood, I come by it a little bit honestly, and I appreciate NOFA Mass's attention to this, because of the connection that Native Americans have with the teaching European settlers how to make this wonderful product that we all still enjoy and that many of us make our livings off of. So that's my whole spiel, and we've got 25 minutes left. So if folks are interested in asking me questions live, I'm happily hanging around to answer them.
Thank you, Kate. That was fantastic. I do want to invite folks, since we are a reasonably sized group and we have so much time, to ask their questions live. I know that Christy, you had a great question earlier about mineral residues. So definitely feel free to come off mute and ask that question live. If you don't, I'll just ask it for you. But I did just want to ask a quick, I'll use a moderator's privilege here. And Kate, just following up on what you just spoke about, can you elaborate a little bit more on the history of Indigenous people from this area teaching settlers about maple sugaring? Yeah,
yes, and if you're interested, there's a blog post on that as well, many of them actually. But so European settlers started writing about maple syrup as early as the 1500s and 1600s. And so we have a record of sort of how Europeans tended to be very favorably impressed with the taste of maple. And so they wrote about it, and then they wrote about learning how to make it and so forth. And at the time of very early European occupation, it was typical for a tribe to have a sugar camp that was away from their permanent residence. That sugar camp and all the materials that sort of went with it was property of the women of the family and tended to be passed down through the women. There was gender separation in terms of who did what. Women tended to be the ones who boiled down the sap, and they would boil it all the way to sugar, because they were storing sugar in baskets. They didn't have convenient, vessels for liquid. And so actually until the 1950s, there were, it was maple sugar that was the commodity, not maple syrup. And that's just because of, when it became economically possible to store and sell liquid as opposed to sugar. So the natives would typically, make taps and sap collection out of wood. They would also boil in a log that they would put the sap in, let it freeze, chuck out the ice, and then heat rocks and put the rocks in the sap, which was in the wood. And they would do that all the way down to sugar, which is what they would store. The period of time of March was called the sugar moon, and the period of time right before that was called the hunger moon. And so it was like when foodstuffs were getting pretty thin for the winter. And so there are some European accounts very early on that talk about there being, a month where people really only ate maple, a month where maple was so important because it gave people sort of the calories that they needed to get through until when green things started to spring up from the earth. Europeans definitely changed, with the materials that they had, definitely, changed the process of making maple sugar early on with, mostly with the cooking vessels themselves. But like I said earlier, it was still sort of culturally normal, even in the early 20th century, for homesteads to have a sugar camp. So that part kind of persisted. I don't know of anybody who does it that way now, but that part kind of persisted into the mid 20th century.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I think, so I see Ellen has her hand up, but before she asks her question, I just wanted to make sure we handled Christy's questions. Christy has asked me to ask them for her. So Christy's question was mineral residual. Is it just a visual preference, or is there some other drawback to it?
As far as I know, the mineral residual is really just a visual thing. I've certainly made plenty of cloudy syrup in my day, and I can't ever remember tasting anything. Just, in a fancy bottle, looks a little suspect.
What do you do with the residuals afterwards? Do you put them in your compost or anything like that?
Yes. Yeah.
Christy was also wondering, in adding new trees to the land, how many years on acre, on average, until they get good 12-inch diameter?
Yeah, sugar maples are slow. I would say 30 at the, obviously it depends on what the size of the sapling is that you plant. I do have a customer who's runs a nursery in New Jersey, and he and his wife planted trees 30 years ago with the intention of sugaring them with them, and just purchased from me a couple years ago, right? So they waited 30 years and they're ready to go. The benefit is, a tree's root system will mirror the branches. And so your trees, the reason why there are sugar maples lining streets and old hill farms in Vermont is because those farmers knew that would increase the property value, but also that those trees were going to be better producers than the trees that were buried in their woods, or producers for their children and grandchildren, probably not for them. But so the benefit of planting, if you are patient enough, is that you can plant in wide open spaces and give yourself some really productive trees.
Awesome. Ellen, would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
I actually have a few, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Some of them could be answered probably pretty quick. I've always been one of those people who likes the B grade better than the A, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Sure.
The other thing is I like the water, I like it before it gets to the syrupy stuff. So I'm wondering if, your kit would be appropriate for that. And if you could talk about that. I wanted to know if you can tap Japanese maple, if it's indeed a maple. And then I love birch. So I'm wondering if you have any experience with that. Thank you. And this is wonderful, by the way. I love
Thank
this.
you. Thanks. Yeah, I can answer all those questions. Japanese maple is a maple. I don't know anybody who's sugared with one, but I'm assuming that you can. If you do, please let me know. Birch, you can, so what I didn't mention is that there's a whole lot of other things you can do with evaporating equipment once you have it. And in addition to making maple syrup, I have customers who make black walnut syrup. Black walnut sap season is the same season as maple. So it's an either or, unless you're going to mix together, which people do. It's a ratio that's more like 60-to-1. Birch is a ratio that is more than 100-to-1. I see 100, 110, 120, depending on the kind of birch. It is what they do in northern arboreal forests. So Alaska is actually the biggest birch syrup producer in the world. It is culturally normal. You know, it's a thing that people do even in their backyards in in Russia.
Yep.
In Europe. I don't know anyone. We tell ourselves we're going to do it every year. We've never done it because by the time maple sugaring season is over, we're ready to move on to other pursuits like the garden. And so I don't know anybody who's made birch on our equipment, but there's no reason that you couldn't, especially if you had an RO, a home RO. To get that ratio down, you can actually run sap through an RO a couple of times. So I could take, for example, some 40-to-1 sap and make it 20-to-1 and then run it through again and make it 10-to-1. So you could take 100-to-1 and get it down to 25-to-1 with 2 runs through an RO, and that would feel quick. 25-to-1 would feel quick on the Sapling Evaporator. So try it. Birch syrup is wonderful. I agree. And then your first question.
The water was another question about
yeah. So I'm assuming you're asking because you're wanting to know like do you want to know how to sterilize it or?
You know what? I've got an old maple out in front. You know, I could easily get a bucket and a tap, and I just want to give it a shot because I love the water.
Yeah.
Even more than the syrup. It's a lot less sweet. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what the process is.
Yeah, you don't need my equipment. Honestly, some people just drink it without processing it at all. I wouldn't sell it that way. And I guess if I were worried about it, I would boil it for 15 minutes and then store it in a refrigerated situation or freeze it in the freezer. But I agree with you. I have customers who use it instead of water to make coffee during the season. And my kids just drink it like tea. Like we'll just heat it up and drink it like tea. So I'm with you.
And then the last one was the bee question. And I have to just preface this question by saying, I used to live up in Quebec. So like, everybody has their own sugar camp for sure.
So the B grade, so the color of syrup is directly tied to how long you had to boil it to get it down to syrup. And syrup is defined by its sugar density, and it's measured by the professionals by something called a hydrometer with units called bricks. And interestingly, the density of syrup is different depending on which state you're in. So I've heard people say that the reason why Vermont maple syrup is so well loved is that our bricks reading is actually higher. In order to call it Vermont maple syrup, you have to cook it just a little bit longer than somebody in Ohio, right? So it's sweeter. And if you overcook syrup but don't quite get to cream or candy or sugar, you'll see what I mean. You'll get some rock candy looking stuff at the bottom of your jar eventually, but the rest of the syrup will just be really thick and really, really sweet. So that color is just caramelized sugar. The sap that comes out of a tree at the very beginning of the season, the first run of sap, has the most sugar out of any sap that tree is going to produce in that sugaring season. And so you don't have to cook that first sap as much to get syrup. And that's what used to be called grade A fancy. The history of why there is a history, there is sort of a business history about how that became a prized commodity, that grade A fancy, that lightest syrup. It is no longer so that is the most expensive bottle of syrup that you'll find, even at your local sugar house. I would be surprised to hear that there's still a price differential between, what is now called grade A light amber and your grade A dark amber. The consumer tastes have changed, and the business of making maple syrup has changed, and it's kind of gone away from, and I think that's why the grading changed just a couple of years ago is sort of a response to the fact that people are no longer willing to pay more for that light stuff. There are an awful lot of people who prefer the dark stuff.
Hey, Kate, this is
Hi.
Fern. So my question is, you were just talking about the rock candy, so to speak.
Yes.
As I told you earlier, this will be our third season going into this, and I've noticed that we take our syrup, they're all in ball jars, and they go into our backroom refrigerator, and we use them as we need them. Over the last couple of months, as I pull those jars out, I'm noticing that rock candy, which is fine because I'll eat it, I'll put it in my coffee, I'll bake with it, but why does that happen? Why am I getting rock candy and it's a heavy sediment and the top is fine, but the bottom is solid rock candy?
Yeah, I think you probably just cooked it a little long.
Okay.
Since I'm not 100% confident in my answer, only because you're refrigerating it instead of canning it. And I've not done that and not seen how the syrup behaves differently in that situation. But I still think, in my experience, I only get that rock candy, which is good, but really hard to get out of your jar at the very end there. Because of overcooking. Yeah.
So what you're saying then is that instead of us we thought we just had to put in the refrigerator, as long as we do that tipping over, seal the jar, so to speak, it's shelf stable?
Yeah, it can be shelf stable. This is official speak. It can be shelf stable up to 2 years.
That's great. That's a game changer for us.
Good.
I also want to just go back to what Ellen said about that water. I have to say that my tip is I'm a baker and I love baking. And there's two things I do with that water. We boil it 50%, so it's just starting to get caramelized.
Yep.
It is fantastic when you're cooking and you're baking. I use it in salad dressings. I use it in so many things. But I got to tell you, game changer, we use that in the late winter, early spring to make the most amazing mixed drinks.
Oh.
Yes, 50%, and I will send you the recipe that we make.
Thank you.
At my 60th birthday 2 years ago, we made a whole batch of this stuff that was 50% of that syrup, and it was divine.
Great.
So I'll let you know.
Please do.
Yeah. So just bringing that what Ellen was saying is, you boil it for the 15 minutes and then just drink it straight. And I also learned about the amazing amount of vitamins and minerals and nutrients. Like, people don't realize that this is kind of like honey. There's a lot of really good stuff in there.
There's 47, I think, different kinds of minerals and vitamins. And in particular, if you happen to be manganese deficient, it's like incredibly rich in that particular mineral. There's one thing I just thought of that I want to make sure I say, and that is, we were talking about different tree saps, and I didn't even come close to listing them all. There's also other things you can make syrup out of. I think it was when you said honey, Fern, that I remembered this. Apple cider can be boiled down to apple cider syrup or apple cider jelly. The apple cider syrup is probably 6-to-1 or 8-to-1, so it's great training for if you think you want to be a sugar maker, but you're like a little nervous about it. You'll see how easy it is. And apple cider syrup is so good in barbecue sauces and dressings and on pancakes and in baking. There's also a whole line of syrups that people make by foraging and sweetening. So spruce tip syrup is lovely. It's the new growth on spruce, boiled with honey or sugar and then evaporated. Elderflower, elderberry, all sorts of things that people in different parts of the world that is like, elderflower and syrup is like maple syrup in Austria. Spruce tip syrup is like maple syrup in parts of Alaska. So there's a whole lot of different things that you can do sort of once you get the hang of one syrup.
Hey, Kate, this is Fern. One question about what you just said. So are you saying that like an elderberry tree or even a spruce, are we tapping it, or we're just we're boiling down the raw material?
You soak there's a company called Silver Hill Maple. Check me, I've blogged about it. They're in Vermont, and they make, in addition to maple syrup, they make an elderflower syrup and a spruce tip syrup, and they do it by clipping the new growth off the spruce tip, you know, the light green parts in the spring, and soaking that with honey and water, and then re-evaporating it. And then also, it's the same process with elderberry flowers. So earlier in the season, before the berries come out, you clip the flowers and soak them with honey, and then re-evaporate, honey or sugar, and then re-evaporate. So those two syrups were actually syrups that became really popular after the Second World War in war-torn Europe as a substitute for honey, actually, which became very expensive at that time. But it's something that's happened at different periods of history in different places on the globe as well.
I think we can do one more quick question before I go through our announcements verbally, but I have been putting some links in the chat, so just please do the evaluation, folks. It really helps us. But yeah, anyone have one last question? All right, hearing none. I just want to say thank you, Kate, so much. This has been incredibly informative. I have learned so much. I'm definitely going to be going back and rewatching this because I've had a few administrative things to deal with in the background, but I'm really excited to rewatch this because I can tell it was extremely well organized. And oh, I just want to ask you, did you drew those illustrations?
I did. One of the things about being an attorney is that I know how not to break the law. And you're not allowed to steal people's art. You're just not. So even though I'm not terribly good at it, I really do. I love botanical drawings, and so I do my best. Yeah.
I'm getting actually a couple direct messages that people really liked your illustrations. So I was very impressed. They were lovely.
Well, follow us on Instagram if you do that sort of thing. That's where I try to draw, and then my coworker Nikki, my sister-in-law, turns them into infographics. And so the rough draft of the How to Tap a Tree should come out this week with sort of more color and more beauty.
Do you have a second to drop your Instagram handle into the chat here, or you could just
yeah, I can do that.
So while you're doing that, I'll just handle my announcements.
Yeah, great.
So yeah, so we again, we'd appreciate your feedback. So please do the evaluation. That's that SurveyMonkey link. There's a link in the chat for where you can find your next meeting. It just takes you to the right pages of the program book. Also, just flipping the page from that direct link, you can find all of our vendor sessions. And MDAR will be having a live session right after this one, starting at 12:35, on just an overview of their services and grants for local growers and local food enthusiasts. So please do hop into that vendor session to just learn a little bit more about what MDAR does. They're a great partner of NOFA Mass. And there's another link there just to see all of the vendor sessions. And do find, you can always find our vendors, even not during those live sessions. There's a link to the virtual vendor space at the in the program book and on our website. So please do visit those vendors. And of course, the auction. Again, great stuff in the auction. There's some really low bids on some really great stuff over there. So get in on that action before it closes. And if you need any AOLCP information, just email wc@nofamass.org if you have any questions about your AOLCP credits. And we have provided Kate's email address for any follow-up questions, as well as, once again, a link to the website, which has tons of great resources on it. And there is @Vermont Evaporator Company for Instagram. I'm definitely going to be following you on Instagram now.
Yay.
Kate.
I think we have a pan on the raffle. So if you're interested in our smallest pan, not the warming pan, but the smallest divided pan, just called our seedling evaporator pan, is being raffled off. So
I have a feeling bids are going to jump on that one the next hour. Awesome. Well, this is really fantastic. Any closing questions for Kate or for me about any of the other aspects of the conference before we close?
Well, thanks everybody. You've been a great audience. And if you give it a shot, happy sugaring.
Thank you so much, Kate. This is fantastic. All right. Have a great
Bye, everybody.
Everybody see you at the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Kate.